I think we'll get started, if you guys don't mind. Welcome to a new year of History Buffs. We're really excited for our programming starting September, going through next spring. I don't know if you noticed on your way in, we printed up some agendas. Oh, it's back. Okay. So, feel free to grab one on your way out if you haven't already gotten one. We also will have a sign-up sheet there for anybody who's not on the mailing list. And let me just make sure. Oh, Paulette sends her love and greetings. She's sorry she couldn't be here. She's at a genealogy conference doing her incredible things. But she will be here next month. All right. I should probably have introduced myself. I'm Maria. I work at the library. I help Paulette with this event, both as a library employee and as a program committee member, planning these talks and scheduling them and all that. And Lee is the other committee member who is here tonight. So he's in the orange. It's hard to miss. There it is. And that is pretty much it. I will hand it over to our speaker, Bill Taylor, who I will now read the introduction for. Bill Taylor is a retired high school teacher, the last 27 years of which he taught in Missoula. He and his wife, Jan, have written 5 published histories of the Northern Pacific and Great Northern Railways in Montana. They are working on a 6th. In addition, they hosted the September 20th, 2022 National Convention of the Northern Pacific Railway Historical Association's Convention in Missoula. They own their own railroad speeder in which they traveled more than 30,000 miles over 28 years. They also worked aboard the Montana Daylight between 2000 and 2004, a tour train which traveled from Sandpoint, Idaho to Livingston, Montana. Bill and Jan have both been published in a variety of historical journals. Now I'll hand it over to you. Yeah.
Sounds pretty impressive, doesn't it? I do. Does it need more volume? Can you hear me out there? I'm a school teacher. I could probably make East Missoula hear me louder. Okay. Testing 1, 2, 3. How? Everybody hear me? Yes. Okay. I just had a bout of double vision where your eyes don't focus anymore, and they give you prism lenses to refocus it, and they say, don't panic, you haven't had a stroke, you haven't had a tumor, it's just getting old. The alternative of which is grim. And he says that the average person in 2 to 4 months gets over it, and I'm pleased to announce I'm over it, except when I came here tonight, I kind of had deja vu all over again. This is the north side over here, and folks in the north side, please meet the people in the south side over here, and if you want to commingle, that's okay with me. We'll get along a little better. Yes, I'm a retired history and English teacher, primarily English, but for most of my adult life, I've been married to that woman back there, Jan Taylor, who's been my chum and my co-voyager, and we were raised by families that were so similar, it was scary. They were both kind of into out in the woods, going to mining camps, ghost towns, things like that. And when we got married, as we did in 1969, we continued that. And we loved, in those days, the mining camps were still there. Now EPA has torn most of them down and bulldozed the earth so you don't even know where they were. But we discovered when we were doing that, that the secret to most mining camps as to whether they were successful or not was if they had good transportation. And transportation in the late 19th century was always railroads. So those that were online tended to be successful, and those that weren't are ghost towns. Online is a phrase we all empathize with now, many years later, isn't it? Because now, if you're online with the internet, then you're probably successful. You almost have to be in business nowadays. And if you're not, then you're probably a dinosaur like me. So think of what I'm going to talk about tonight in the context of what we're living through now with the internet, and I think you'll have some notion of how excited people were in places like Missoula when they heard that the railroad was going to come through, because that was a success. And Missoula is very much of a railroad town. One time had 2 transcontinental railroads that went through it, still has one, because BNSF is coming back. Yes, Montana Rail Link was a regional, but most of what they did was forward BNSF traffic, so I still think of them as a transcontinental railroad. So we're going to talk about this in several dimensions. Let me put my first slide up. Can everybody see this all right? We're going to talk about this tonight in terms of history, a little bit of history, a little bit about the railroad. We'll even show you some train pictures. But we're going to focus more on economics, the economics of what the railroad did for Missoula and what Missoula did for the railroad. And we're going to talk about culture, because unlike a lot of railroad interested people that I know, it's not about locomotives, it's not about track, it's not about buildings, it's about people. It's about people who do these things and how they interact and how they live together and the culture they create. And that's what is perpetuated, not the equipment, because it's soon obsolete and is gone. So their little philosophical statement. Jay Leinster, do you know who took that picture? Because I was suspicious it might have been you.
Not me.
I'm sorry. Do you know who did? We have several retired MRL people in the audience tonight, so if you have very specific questions about how to run a locomotive or any of that stuff, these gentlemen are all good at that. Jay Leinster retired as a civil engineer for the Milwaukee Road and for Montana Rail Link. Mr. Milt Clark retired as a marketing agent for Montana Rail Link. Mr. France over there drove trains, and where's Al Burns? Al's back there, and he also drove trains. They're all retired now, so if something bounces off the side of my head, like a Coke can, it probably means I got something wrong. There's nothing like writing a book to make people think you know something about the subject. And when you write 5 of them, all of a sudden you get to be some sort of an expert. And I don't consider myself an expert, but we do have a lot of knowledge about railroading in Montana and its importance to the state. And Jan is very much a partner in all this, so I'm up here talking, but she probably knows more about the subject than I do. Little chronological history of the railroads in Missoula. The Northern Pacific was the first in here in 1883. We'll talk more about that in a minute. The Great Northern was the second that came through 10 years later, but it was up on the High Line. For those of you who don't know where the High Line is, that's the route of US 2 up along the Canadian border. Went over Marias Pass north of here to the coast. The third one was the Milwaukee Road, which was another 15 years down the road. They came here as the Johnny-come-lately to try and do competition with the Great Northern and the NP, and we'll talk more about them as well, but they had a presence here in Missoula. And then in 1970, the 2 Hill lines, which is the NP and the GN, named after J.J. Hill, John Jay, who was the president of the Great Northern, combined with 3 others into the Burlington Northern, which morphed again in '96 to the BNSF after the merger with the Santa Fe, which they spun off in '87 to Montana Rail Link as a regional carrier when it looked like railroading was a dying industry, and then they're going to come back again. Do we know when that's going to happen? Sometime in the next 6 months? Next year, as BNSF again. 2 other entities in Montana. The Union Pacific, which came up from the south. The Union Pacific was actually the first railroad into Montana in 1882 in the form of a narrow gauge that came up from Pocatello arrived at Benina Pass in 1880, and into Butte, Montana in 81, and then on to Garrison in 82, and there's more to that story. And then, of course, our beloved Amtrak, which was formed in 1971, when it was believed that everybody was going to ride airplanes or drive on the new interstate highways and passenger trains were going to be obsolete. And it was created to kind of ease the transition into nothingness. But it's still here. And we still hear a lot about Amtrak. And I think some of you have had the enjoyable experience of actually riding Amtrak if you go up to Whitefish and get up on the High Line. So if we look at the Northern Pacific in specific, we are probably all familiar with the driving of the last golden spike at Gold Creek, Montana, as immortalized by F.J. Haynes, the photographer, and on a number of plaques and books. And most of that statement was just wrong. Northern Pacific, it's true, wasn't at Gold Creek, Montana. It was at Independence Creek, another 4 miles to the east. And it wasn't on September the 8th, 1883. It was actually on August the 22nd, 1883. The September 8th event was primarily a party for the chief guys, rich investors who we hauled out here in 4 sections of a private train out of St. Paul and another section out of Portland to meet out there to do the celebratory last driving, and it wasn't a golden spike. There are rumors, this is something Jan's gotten into pretty heavy. There actually were maybe 3 golden spikes out there that day, but none of them got driven. They probably all got melted down in the next couple of days, put back in the bank. The one that was driven by the guy who drove the first spike at Carlton, Minnesota in 1870 when it first started west. And there are some reports that it was the same spike that he drove out here at Independence Creek. So all of those nice stage pictures you see of F.J. Haynes, and I didn't bother to bring one because he wasn't there. He was in the 4th section of the Eastern Excursion trains, which was running about 3.5 hours behind the 1st section. The 1st section was 3 hours late getting to Independence Creek. About 3:30 in the afternoon, guess when the 4th section got there? About 6:30. It's September. It's getting dark. It's forest fire season. We all know what this country does when the smoke's rolling. Those old primitive cameras didn't work in bad lighting. They're old wet plate, glass plate things, a lot of equipment, couldn't capture motion. So Haynes didn't get photos of the last spike. However, he knew he was going to be late, and he had a telegraph, and he did whistle up a guy from, we think, Butte to come out and get some stock footage before the event actually happened. So if you look at Haynes' photographs of the event, most of them posed, very few people around, very clean and neat, very well organized, as opposed to the picture I'm showing you right now, which is done by another guy by the name of Davidson, who was actually on the train, taking a picture of the driving of the actual last spike, and it's pure chaos. You can see that. There's 3,000 people there. They've all come in with their horses and buggies and every other way they can get to witness this last event. They all want to see it, so they all go up around it. There's dust, there's flies. God knows where all the horses and carriages are. There's at least 13 trains there that we can account for that are all puffing out black smoke, making noise and doing things. The place had to be chaos. And you know how many privies you can see in this picture? 0. There is one picture that shows a view kind of across the edge of the pavilion, and you can see about 1,000 buggies parked out there with all the horses and dust and flies and so on. So we're thinking that this thing was pure chaos. Nobody got an actual picture of the driving of the last spike because of the darkness and the smoke and the dust and the disorganization. And by the time they were done, I think Henry Villard, who had organized the whole thing, was just about ready to have a nervous breakdown because he was going broke. He'd funded most of the last construction with his own private money. And in November, he did go into bankruptcy. So he was German anyway, so. The railroad knows where it happened. This is the sign that's still out there to this day. Montana Rail Link renewed that sign when the train I worked on, the Rocky Mountain Daylight, was coming through. And it still survives. It's still very attractive. There's no public access to that site. You have to go across a cement bridge to the other side of the river, and there's a whole bunch of no trespassing signs over there from the local landowner. You can get a picture of it from the gravel pit on the old frontage road, but it's just really hard to get to. A few years ago, after we published our first book, I get a phone call from some guy, and he's out at Gold Creek, Montana. You all know where that is? How many have been to Gold Creek, Montana? All right, you know what it looks like. And he's absolutely irate. He says, this is where the railroad came together, and there's not even a sign here to commemorate that. There's no historical marker, there's no billboard, there's no nothing. And he just goes on for 15 minutes. I'm trying to get a word in edgewise. And finally, when he came up for air, I said, you're in the wrong place. Big pause on the other end. Boy, I've got this book. It says it happened at Gold Creek. I says, no. Go down the freeway to the east to the next rest area from the Gold Creek exit. Go into the rest area. You'll see a bunch of signs to the Montana Historical Society, which is as close as they could get to Independence Creek, telling you the whole story. Gold Creek's not where it happened. That's a myth. Well, you know what about myths? When it's a choice between myth and reality, guess which always wins? This is even commemorated in our own state capitol building. This is a painting that was donated to the state of Montana by a variety of people. It hangs in the rotunda under the vault by Amédée Jolin, donated in 1895, showing President Ulysses S. Grant with a hammer in his hand. Implies that he had something to do with driving the rail. Behind his left shoulder is Henry Villard, who was the head of the railroad at that time, and other dignitaries behind his left shoulders. Yes, there were Crow Indians there. They'd been brought up to dance ceremonially for these folks. We're only talking 6 years after Custer died on the Little Bighorn, so these Easterners were a little nervous about this. The night before, they'd been down at Grey Cliff, and they had a little reenactment down there, and the Indians got a little out of hand. I think some of the railroad guys got a little out of hand. First thing you know, they were hooping it up and running through the train, and everybody just about had a fit over that. This is all very staged. Nobody knows what the guy with the striped pole is doing. Jay, you're a civil engineer. What's that striped pole for? Is that an old rod?
The range pole.
Range pole? Okay, so well, they get him in there. And all this happens, it proudly denotes on the plaque below it at Gold Creek, Montana on September 8th, 1883. Missoula has a role to play in this. If you look at the geology of western Montana, one of the few east-west valleys that cuts through the Rocky Mountains, at least over here on the west side of the Continental Divide, is the valley of the Clark Fork. It is the logical route if you're going east and west. The Indians knew that, the natives knew that. They had used this route to go to the buffalo for thousands of years. There was I've heard as much as a 200-foot wide trail going up the Blackfoot that was marked with stone pylons where the natives could keep track as highway markers to make sure they got to the buffalo all right. Why Lewis and Clark didn't follow that route is a good question. Had they probably would have gotten to the West Coast a lot sooner than they did, but that's a whole different story. When these first surveys were done, and that was done in the 1850s, a gentleman by the name of Isaac Stevens, who was later the governor of Washington Territory, he actually fought in the Civil War for the Union Army, but he was given the job of surveying a possible route to the West Coast for a transcontinental line up here along the Canadian border, and did so and reported back very favorably about the route through the Clark Fork and on west of here. although he had posed a number of alternatives. So it was well known to the locals by 1855-56 that there's going to be a railroad coming through here. And you can imagine, for a place like Hellgate Village out here west of town, what news that was for people who were trying to do business as grain merchants and all kinds of purveyors of merchandise to the mining camps and so forth. So a couple of the notables got together with the Northern Pacific, and the Missoulian reported, or excuse me, the Helena Herald reported on August the 9th, 1882, that a deal had been struck for land through the Missoula city limits, providing that the Northern Pacific would agree to build shop facilities and a major terminal here, as opposed to maybe Frenchtown or somewhere else where Missoula wouldn't get any benefits of that. Whereupon the locals went out and bought up all that land over here and were ready to make it rich on that. But that almost guaranteed Missoula, as early as 1870, that they were going to be a place on this upcoming railroad. To that end, Mr. Warden of Warden's Market put away a keg of whiskey that he announced would be tapped when and if the railroad ever showed up. Little did he realize it was going to be 13 years before that happened. But the Missoulian says in this story that he kept it down there in the basin of Warden's Market, which I think is pretty much where Warden's Market still is. And sure enough, when the last spike was driven in September of 1883, or was it August? I forget. Oh yeah, one of those. They broke out the keg, and the Missoulian is proud to announce that a party was had by all to celebrate the arrival of the railroad. The crews, the construction crews had just been paid off. They had been hauled back to Missoula where they were given their pay and had time off. And I think it had to look a little like homecoming in town. Big deal for Missoula. So let me just stop for a minute and talk about what this meant for Missoula. Until the railroad, which was first developed in the 1830s, really didn't come into its own until the 1840s, but during the Civil War was found out to be absolutely essential to provide quicker transportation for men and materials to conduct war, that anybody had ever traveled faster than a horse could run. Think about that for a minute. For the thousands and thousands of years that human beings have been on this planet, nobody had gone faster than a horse could run. Unless, of course, they fell off a cliff and then they didn't live to tell about it. So a railroad, which is going in those days 35 miles an hour, or maybe on straight tangent track on level grade 45 miles an hour, was about twice the speed of what a horse could run. A journey that had taken 6 months on the Oregon Trail to get from the Mississippi River to the West Coast would now take about 6 or 7 days. Can you imagine the benefits of that? There was some people, though, that were always naysayers in every crowd. There were some folks that said the human body isn't built to withstand speeds of that magnitude. And they had research to show that when you get above 45 miles an hour, the human body is just going to fall apart. Little did they know. The other thing about railroads is that if you look at the economics of transportation, the steel wheel on the steel rail has such a low coefficient of friction that it is the second cheapest form of transportation known to man. As of now, we might get somewhere, teleportation or something, but right now it's the second cheapest, right behind water travel. So the first model for railroads would be to connect seaports, Puget Sound to the West Coast, Minneapolis to the Gulf, that sort of thing, so that you could transfer the freight and passengers from one form of cheap transportation to another. Those economics change dramatically, and Jay backed me up on this, the minute you start going up a grade. And then that coefficient of friction is such that the efficiency goes down about was it 50% for every percent of grade, something like that? Jay's looking like he doesn't know the answer to that. I don't either. But anyway, it falls off rapidly. So it was to the advantage of the early surveyors to find as level a route as possible to get here or to get wherever it is they were going with their railroad construction. My granddad, who worked for the state highway department for many years, said we owe our highway system in Montana to the buffalo. And you got to think about that for a minute. And his reasoning was the buffalo inhabited the prairies out here for millions of years, and they left trails. And the natives came along and they followed the trails and hunted the buffalo, and the fur trappers came along and followed the native trails, and then the homesteaders and the wagon trains came and followed them, and the first thing you know, it was the Montana Highway Department. And if you look at a highway map of Montana, it looks very much like a railroad map because they all follow the low ground, they all follow the water, they're all following the buffalo as the cheapest way to get from A to Z. Excuse me? Oh, sorry. I thought there might be a question. So there are some built-in efficiencies to railroads that gave early settlers in Montana a real leg up economically to if it comes to their town. If you look at the way the railroads developed, the Northern Pacific was the first one through, entered the state out at Glendive, went up the Yellowstone River to Livingston, over the hill at Bozeman, out across the Gallatin Valley, over the hill at Mullen Pass, west of Helena, and down the Clark Fork and out of the state, the lowest grade possible. And where have all the largest cities in Montana grown up? Along I-90, which connected all the largest cities in Montana. The second railroad through was the Great Northern. It came through on the High Line, essentially followed the Missouri River and the Milk River and the Marias River and out through the Kootenai River out the west side. If you look at the cities that grew up there, and I don't mean any of this in a demeaning way, those are the second level economic centers, the smaller towns that grew up along there. By the time the Milwaukee comes through in 1908, 1910, and they came up the Yellowstone as far as Forsyth and then up the Musselshell and then over through a complicated way to get down to the Missouri and then over the pass at not Homestake, but Pipestone Pass and Butte and then down the Clark Fork. Where have those, what are the level of the economic centers? They're the third tier. There are places like Harleton and Forsyth and Baker and Alberton because the model was shifting at that point, and that's why they were the last one to build here. But for those who came first, for those who captured that market, for those who could provide reliable transportation and freight to ship on it, they have grown tremendously, as Missoula saw it would. This is an 1884 bird's eye map of Missoula, which would be a year after the railroad was completed. And if you look at it, you'll notice that there's railroad infrastructure already here. Let me get my pointer out here. There's the depot right there. And there's the shops over there. These are still the little 7 buildings that you see in the Haynes photograph at that time. There's not a roundhouse as such. Down here is the old Mullen Road through Missoula with Hammond's Power Corner down here where the Mercantile was. And where the other businesses was too. What do you notice about this map? What did you not expect about this? Well, if you're like me, it's all this vacant territory between town and the railroad. If the railroad is such a hot property for commerce, why aren't there buildings down there? And the conclusion that we've come to is that Higgins Avenue, which is right here, lines up with the bridge, there's already a bridge across the river, was already owned by Higgins. And old C.P. Higgins is not a dummy. And he knows that the railroad's coming to town and where it's going to be, and he owns the land. What does that mean? Prices are exorbitant for those lands. And the NP, which was facing bankruptcy square in the face when it came through town, decided, well, we'll just go down here a couple of blocks and maybe we'll create town down there, because they had a way of doing that. And they put their shops a couple of blocks the other way. It's the same. So the first depot in Montana is actually down here about where the Orange Street underpass is, on what was then Harris Street. And the crossing was at Woody. And that depot is going to survive down there from 1884 when it's built until 1902 when the one we now know of here at the head of Higgins Avenue was built, which is another story in its own right. And if you look at even more recent maps of Missoula, to this very day, if you go up onto Waterworks Hill and look down at where the old roundhouse was there below you, and that lands south of the tracks on North Higgins, it's pretty sparse in there. You know, there's a parking lot for the old Missoula building, the farmers market's in there. It's certainly not where the most vibrant businesses are in our community and never has been. So something went wrong with the model here somewhere. And Missoula didn't quite develop the way it was intended. There was a family that had a ranch over here. Erlin owned most of that property, and Mr. Erlin was of a different mindset than Mr. Higgins, and he donated the NP the land for their depot and their shops. And Erlin's place is about where the Highlander Brewery was later, and about where end of housing is on that road that goes around the north side of the tracks over there. Again, I had to marvel at these maps. This is 1884. No human being has seen this view. So how does the artist do it? And you know, they're amazingly accurate. You look at maps. Obviously, they developed a skill of kind of taking the bird's eye, I guess that's why they were called bird's eye, and doing these. And they do it nationwide. There's thousands of these for cities all over the country at this era. Yes?
I wonder if the town grew up more on Front Street Higgins, because in fact, Front Street was the mall, and there was no railroad, so everything started to develop from Cedar to Broadway.
Scott, right? Yes. I totally agree. And we have a problem in Montana where those cities were already here before the railroad. You look at Helena, you look at Bozeman, you look at Missoula, which were all places before the railroad actually got here in 1883, and the depots are a long ways out of town. They're way out there because the land was so expensive in an already commercialized district that they didn't want to pay the prices and assumed the railroad would draw the business to them. And didn't always work that way. Didn't always work that way, but you're right on. This is an interesting building. This building is actually going to survive until 1948. Some of you who are a little older than I am, I was born in 46, and unfortunately I don't remember much about 48, may remember this down here because it survives after 1902 as the freight house. It was moved slightly, a little bit farther to the north and a couple of tracks put in behind it. But it's pretty much the same location until almost 1950 when it suffers a fire and the NP decides to replace it with the brick structure that later became Northern Pacific Transport, which is now, I believe, a bunch of engineering offices across from the Montana Hotel to Antique Mall down there. Anybody recognize this building? This is the second depot in Missoula. What? What? We've never seen that before. Well, by 1896, things had evolved to the point where the NP wanted to have a presence on Higgins Avenue. Higgins Avenue was obviously going to be the main drag in Missoula, and they wanted to have a building that would be at the head of that, so when everybody looks down the commercial district, they're going to see the NP depot down at the end of town. So they designed this wonderful structure. It was to be built out of granite. In fact, it was mostly built, and it was going to be a very imposing structure. But just before it was done, they had an arsonist show up in Missoula. And this warehouse building, which is Higgins' warehouse over there on the land he owned was torched. And then a couple weeks later, the depot was torched. And while the Missoulian, if you read this article here, Firebug War, if you read that story, you find out they're not calling it arson, but there was a suspiciously strong smell of kerosene. And it appears to be the problem was that they blocked Higgins Avenue from crossing the tracks. The north side was objecting to being isolated north of the tracks. They didn't have a good crossing, a way to interact or get to downtown in an easy manner. Does that sound at all familiar to anybody? You know, it's why we end up with the pedestrian footbridge and ongoing efforts to ease that little problem. At any rate, this building got about this far and it was torched and had to be demolished. By this time, C.P. Higgins had died. It was his son, Dave, who had had a different feeling about the railroad and had to volunteer not only the land for the railroad, but it had also undertaken to construct it for the railroad. What are you hearing in that? We're hearing a realization that that railroad thing is going to be good for business. We don't really know how it all turned out for Mr. Young Higgins, but we think we probably lost his shirt somewhere along there because it was not insured. The railroad didn't own it yet, so they aren't going to pay for it. And we think he probably suffered some financial setbacks. So another 5 years or so, things linger on while historical stuff happens. And finally, the NP decides to take a second run at building a depot down there at the end of Higgins. This time it's going to be a Northern Pacific project that was done by NP Architects. This is supposed to be sort of a Renaissance style building. Looks kind of four-square to me. But anyway, in 1901, construction began. Here's a picture of it under construction. And in 1902, it entered service, and it's still there 120 years later. It no longer serves as a railroad function. On the third floor is the Dennis Washington Achievement Center because the building actually belongs to his wife, Phyllis. The second floor, the last time I heard, was Yellowstone Pipeline Company. And the first floor, I think, is a series of stockbrokers. We'll talk more about the problem that creates a little bit later. But it was a very busy place. And when this picture was taken by photographer R.H. McKay, from Waterworks Hill looking south, you can see how busy the Missoula Northern Pacific facilities have become. There's all sorts of things here. This is roundhouse number 3. There will be 6 before they're done. Missoulian joke, they need to make the back wall of the roundhouse rubber, so as those longer engines kept coming in, they could just push that back wall out. They wouldn't have to build a new roundhouse every time one of them got a bigger engine. This is the original coal facilities. There'll sooner be another one down here. A variety of back shops for the roundhouse where equipment that's being worked on was positioned and stores were kept. We see across the street there the new depot. We see the powerhouse, the water tank, which will later be moved farther down in the yard, but you could go down there to this very day, if you don't mind trespassing on rail link. You'll see where that water tank was. There's still a capped well there that is, I guess, still available for water. Notice the land here is still underutilized in 1905, but town is creeping in. It's creeping that way. The NP, railroads do everything by standard plans. They have found it's cheaper if you just build 50 of the same depot than to do a one-off all the time. So if you went to all the small towns in Montana on the Northern Pacific or the Great Northern or the Milwaukee, you're going to find depots that look pretty much like each other. Most of them were prefab back east somewhere and hauled out here on flat cars and erected rather than built. These main town depots are one-offs that the NP was using as flagships, as advertising for their railroad. in the day where the depot was the railroad in town. Now you got to think about this for a minute. You think about your computer and you think about the internet. How does that internet stuff get to your computer? It goes through a server, right? It's a place that brings all that together and dishes it out as you type in requests on your search engine. And that's what depots did in the 19th century. Everything by 1905 that came into Missoula came through that building. Freight, people, money, telegraph services, you name it, it came through that depot. It was the center of town's business. From the depot, then it was disseminated out to wherever it was going, but that was the place. And there was a whole cadre of folks working in that building that took care of all those processes. If you wanted to send a telegram, you went to the depot. Yes, there was a Western Union office, but quite often Western Union went through the depot because the railroad had the telegraph wires. If you needed to send a check to Sears and Roebuck for your flivver, where did you go do that? At the express office in the depot. If you wanted to go to Chicago, where did you go? To the depot. You had to buy a ticket and the ticket agent. That was the center. So people living in Missoula in 1905 saw that building down there like what? It's not quite like the airport today because not all of us ride airplanes and not all services go through the airplanes. But it is just like a computer network. It was the place. So it paid the folks, the railroads, to have nice brick depots in towns that could afford it. Everywhere else got either I-towns or T-towns. You know the difference between an I-town and a T-town? Well, and visualize an I. Anywhere terrain was restricted, like with a river or something else, then the railroad tended to parallel the river, and the depot and the main street paralleled the railroad, and that becomes an I-town. And those places where there was more room, particularly on the flat land, quite often they would have Main Street right angles to the railroad, and the depot was at the end of the T, and that's a T-town. And there are hundreds of examples of that in Montana on all of the major railroads. If you think about Drummond, I-town or T-town? I-town, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, so you just find examples. St. Regis, which is kind of, or not St. Regis, I'm sorry, Superior, which is kind of different. That was, there was a reason for that out there, well, I'm not going to go into, is more of a T-town. You know, you think about where the railroad is across the river, and then the main street that goes down across the bridge over to where the old town was, which was the original Superior, then that's a T-town. So what you say? I don't know, just thought it was interesting. By the time we get a little bit later, we see BN coming to town. There's a, well, amongst those who know, there's about a 50-year history to Burlington Northern before 1970. James J. Hill managed to acquire the NP financially in 1896. He acquired the CB&Q about the same time. They also owned the FW&D, the Fort Worth and Denver, and the CNS. And he packaged them all together in about 1905 as the Northern Securities Plan. And it's the first run at BN, because in another 65 years, that's exactly what's going to be approved as Burlington Northern. At the time, Teddy Roosevelt was president, and they were very concerned about the role that monopolies were having on American economics. And the Sherman Antitrust Act had been enacted. And so the Northern Securities Plan was turned down, and Hill was forced to give up absolute control of the other four railroads but he never really did. He still had his hands in the finances of them. And so eventually circumstances change in 1970, and that plan is done. This is a picture taken by a fellow by the name of Bennett who lived out in Superior, and it shows the CB&Q red and the Great Northern blue and the Northern Pacific yellow and black. He's missing an FWD and the CNS, but what the heck, it's a good picture. Our depot down here suffers a little bit. It's a gradual process of moving things out of Missoula over the next 20 years. First, the telegraphers are shut down, then the dispatchers go. And as things become more and more automated, there's less and less going on in the building. And the biggest criticism that the people who lived through 1970 had, the first thing they did was come down there and paint out those beautiful monads on those scrolls up on the corners of the depot with black. So there was no evidence of the pre-merger heralds, and they did that all over the system. Here's a 1982 picture I took of a coal train, Burlington Northern coal train coming through Missoula westbound, and there's cars parked on the platform because there's no passenger service anymore, and da-da-da-da-da-da. That leads in 1971 to the formation of Amtrak. The last year that passenger trains collectively made a profit in the United States of America was 1929. After that, they still existed, and the railroads constantly attempted to upgrade service and upgrade the glamour. We get all those glitzy ads, the streamlined trains and so forth. But the truth is they were using them as loss leaders. Those in business know what a loss leader is, for the freight that interest would generate. The trains themselves were losing money increasingly as you go through the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Amtrak was intended to be a way to take the burden of the passenger trains off of the common carrier railroads, make it a quasi-government agency subsidized by the government, and it wasn't going to last. I mean, think about 1971. Interstate highway is just being completed, airports are blossoming, jets are getting bigger and faster and more wonderful. Who's going to ride a train in another 10 years? And they figured it would just go away. Well, they found out there are some people who don't want to give up riding trains. They continued to do so, saw it as an advantage to being pushed into a steel culvert and blasted into the air, and now being frisked down, or rattling along on an interstate highway with 57 trucks per mile trying to find your way in and out. And they see riding along in a nice bedroom suite on Amtrak as a far more luxurious way to travel. Unfortunately, Amtrak hasn't been very good at luxurious bedroom suites over the years. It's always been grossly underfunded. The subsidies, as politics ebbs and flows, were greater or lesser, and to the point where Amtrak was very unable to even meet the maintenance of the fleet they had. And so things like North Coast Hiawatha that came through Missoula was canceled in 1979. The Empire Builder up on the High Line struggles from year to year. At one point was reduced to 3 days a week service, now is back again. And we'll talk more about Amtrak in a little while. Then along comes railing. Interesting things happened in the industry in the 1980s. The 70s and 80s sees a great decline in railroading. Railroads aren't doing well. Trucks are making huge inroads into the market base of railroads. They're losing money wholesalely. They're highly regulated by the federal government. They can't change rates. They can't abandon track without going through a lengthy process, which isn't often granted. And the conventional wisdom amongst a lot of railroad leaders was, we're done. We're done. They own a lot of land. They own a lot of materials. we'll just capitalize out on what we own and do something else. Milwaukee Road goes bankrupt in 1980. Milton, Jay, you lived through that process. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but by and large, they gave up. They gave up and decided to just shut her down and scrap it out. In 1980, if you owned a share of Chicago-Milwaukee Corporation, which was the company in charge, it was worth about, I think the lowest I saw was about 79 cents a share. You could buy all of it you wanted. Chicago-Milwaukee Corporation is still in business. They're now a real estate outfit. Last time I looked at shares on this New York Stock Exchange, it was $80 a share. What did they do? Got rid of all the liability of running trains, capitalized out on all the land and property that they owned, and did something else. And that's what BN was looking at, too. The management of BN in the 80s was pretty convinced that their railroad was a dying agent and that they were going to have to get out of the business of railroading. And out of that, we see the starting of spin-offs of bits of trackage that were particularly unprofitable or for other reasons to form what we called regional railroads, which was basically most often scrappers who were going to get the value out of the railroad until it wouldn't run anymore, and then they could scrap the stuff out and capitalize on that. But into that steps Dennis Washington and his corporation, negotiates with BN to lease and buy what used to be the Northern Pacific through most of Montana, from Sandpoint, Idaho, to Huntley Junction, east of Billings in Montana. And most of their traffic would be to further BN traffic, but they also had online industries of their own, and it turned out to be a very successful thing. More about railroad here in a bit. And there's our beautiful building. Now, Jay, this is your picture, isn't it? Thank you. This is Jay Lensner's picture that we've used in a variety of things. Jay, what were the circumstances for taking this photo?
Bill Brodsky asked me to take some pictures.
And then didn't use them, as I understand it, right? I have, and I'm not going to pay you anything. And the depot was converted into other things. Like, anybody gone to the Dennis Washington Achievement Center? A couple of you were at the convention last year, got to, didn't you? Because it's by invitation only. And if you go up there, as I've been fortunate to do a couple of times, it's an interesting space. There's floor-to-ceiling photos and things of Washington Corporation's businesses featured. There's a full side of a passenger car up there on the wall, and a lot of glitzy stuff where Washingtons enjoy. When Dennis had his birthday parties here, as he's had a couple of times, and all those Learjets show up, they tend to go up into the Achievement Center to do that. So if you ever get a chance to go up there, do it. It's an interesting trip. And he had resources enough to make a new headquarters for his railroad out on Reserve Street. This is a picture I took in 1992 of Dennis's train making up at the headquarters. They were going down to Darby in this train. He had a bunch of folks on board that he was going to take to dinner. What's the name of that big dude ranch up there? Triple Creek, thank you. They were all going up to dinner there. So when you are wealthy, you can do things like that. I think that's the last time a passenger car was down there. In '96, the parent corporation, BN, went in through another merger and became BNSF when they and the Santa Fe, the other big western railroad that was doing business in the southwest, combined. And it doesn't stand for anything. It's just BNSF. Everybody wants to make it Burlington Northern Santa Fe, but technically it's just BNSF, and it's owned by Warren Buffett. If you own Berkshire Hathaway stock, you're probably very wealthy, as Warren is. So let's talk about the last railroad to come to Missoula, which is the Milwaukee Road. And there's a lot of folks that are very emotionally attached to the Milwaukee Road. It was always sort of the underdog. They were the last one in, the first one out. They never performed quite to the level of the NP or the Great Northern. And it's interesting. They did some nice things with technology. They actually electrified the mountainous zones in the west at a time when everybody else was running steam power. They're responsible in a lot of ways for the huge increase in copper production in Butte to build the system. One of the copper company, ACM's board of directors, then went out to form Montana Power, which in turn built dams like at Thompson Falls, which in turn provided electricity to the Milwaukee Road, and it was all one big happy family. Again, Missoula played an interesting role in the Milwaukee's construction. Unlike the NP, which built from both ends to the middle, the Milwaukee kind of built consecutively and then took leapfrogs as land and materials became available. They had the advantage of having the Northern Pacific running beside them in most places and get materials shipped there. It's now 1908. By now we have big steam shovels and things to construct railroads as opposed to just men with Fresno scrapers. And like the Northern Pacific, the official end golden spike, if you will, you can go see it, it's in Deer Lodge. The official golden spike to the Milwaukee Road happened at Independence Creek. You were going to say Gold Creek, weren't you? Independence Creek. In fact, the two markers are about, what, Jay, 2 miles apart when they were standing down there. That big golden spike that used to be by the Milwaukee was taken down to Deer Lodge at the prison yard down there and stands down there so people can view it. Unfortunately, this is not where the Milwaukee was finally joined together. It made good PR because they could capitalize on all that NP Golden Spike stuff at Gold Creek. But you know where the Milwaukee came together? Missoula, Montana. This is in May, in this photograph. In March, the Milwaukee reached Missoula, and that completed all gaps in the main line west. And there wasn't much of a celebration. Want to see a picture? I can do that. The one on the left is them coming into town right where the Washington Grizzly Stadium is and the physical maintenance plant, which ironically is one of the first pieces of track that got torn up in 1981 when the scrappers came in to take the Milwaukee Road out. If you look at this, see that rock? Well, that's this thing right down there. So this picture is probably about 300 yards farther to the west than this one, but that's the last spike. Now, how did this work? Well, you remember the 1908 flood. The Milwaukee pretty much had their grade built. Winston Brothers Railroad Construction was building both that grade and the newly revamped NP grade through the Clark Fork Canyon down here, when in June, record rainfall hit western Montana and the Clark Fork River flooded big time and washed out all that work and a lot of other things. You've all seen pictures, I'm sure, of the big flood event in 1908. When the waters went down, two interesting decisions were made. The NP decided we're going to rebuild it on our new alignment, but we're going to raise it by 25%. So if there's another flood, hopefully it won't wipe out our line. You ever wondered why when it goes out through the Hellgate out here, that grade is so much higher than the old highway? Well, that's why. It went up in the air because the Hellgate was a particularly nasty spot during the Great Flood. The other decision is that Winston Brothers, at the end of the flood, decided, well, it's going to be a lot easier to rebuild the NP line than it is the Milwaukee. So we're going to rebuild the NP line first so we can haul materials and then rebuild the Milwaukee. Unfortunately, Beavertail Tunnel, you know where Beavertail Hill is, collapsed during the flood. and the Milwaukee didn't want to do the resources necessary to make a shoe fly around it. The NP already had a shoe fly around it on the old grade, and so that's what delayed the completion of the Milwaukee for about 2 months. So they went ahead and celebrated, but the Milwaukee could get traffic through because they were coming through on the NP. So, I don't know, maybe I make too big a deal out of that, but I'm trying to emphasize the importance to Missoula to all these stories. Is it working? Yeah. Oh, good. And I think this building, which was built in 1910, the Milwaukee I have the original blueprints to that. Anyway, they called it Mission Style. Is it Mission Revival Style? Something like that. I don't know that it looks much like a mission. But I've always felt it's an imposing structure, but there's something about that tall tower that isn't quite right. That tall tower always seems like it's a little out of proportion for some reason. And then I found out, guess what? There's a story behind that tower. If you were standing in Higgins Avenue, south of the NP Depot, before the Wilma building was built in 1929, you could see that tower from the NP Depot. In other words, people who were patronizing the NP would realize there's another railroad in town down there. And they're just equidistant apart on both ends of Higgins Avenue to provide the competition, and hence the reason for the tall tower. If you've ever been to Great Falls, and you look at the GN Depot in Great Falls, which has a tower, which originally had a clock on it, and then the Milwaukee showed up there in 1913, and their tower is 10 feet taller. What's that? Oh, okay. So anyway, there are interesting politics, even in the railroad industry. It was originally built as steam-powered, and then in 1917, this part of it was electrified. And later on in 22, there was another electrified zone over in the Cascades, but there was always an interesting gap in the middle in eastern Washington that never did get electrified. And that kind of is a problem for the Milwaukee throughout its history. And I was making the point here a little bit ago that the Milwaukee and the ACM Company, Amalgamated Copper, and Montana Power were kind of corporate cousins via Standard Oil. And Standard Oil Rockefeller didn't like Marcus Daly, didn't think too much of Jim Hill. They had a kind of an ongoing feud. And so Rockefeller decided he was going to build his own railroad to the West Coast, and he was going to take it to the Great Northern and the NP by building the shortest line between Chicago and Puget Sound. And guess what? He did it. It's just that it crossed 5 mountain ranges to get there. And so you end up with all kinds of interesting places, like the Hiawatha Trail out here, where they cross the Bitterroots, where they have to climb up a big horseshoe to get up through an 8,000-foot tunnel and down the other side, which took the costs of construction into the stratosphere and made the indebtedness very high. And they managed to get it open just the same year as the Panama Canal was developed. So a lot of the traffic that was coming on rail before 1910 was diverted on ships through the Panama Canal, and it didn't get any better after that. But one of the things they did have was that connection with Amalgamated Copper, with ACM, with Marcus Daly. Well, he's dead by then, but by his successors, and that included the big mill out at Bonner that we celebrate. If you ever go out to the history group in Bonner's presentation, is very interesting out there. It one time was the largest plywood mill in the nation, and the Milwaukee had the lion's share of traffic out of that for a long time. As their track deteriorated, however, the NP and the BN took a lot of that away. And of course, then the mill is closed now, but for a long time, that was a big revenue producer. And they also built the big Blackfoot extension that went up to, well, as far as, well, the tracks were laid to Woodworth, although the last bit of it was ACM Railroad. They went up as far as Cottonwood, which is about 5 miles past Clearwater Junction, And that was going to be their secondary main line to Great Falls and on into the east side to open up all the Judith Basin and stuff. However, 1920s, we all know what happened to dryland farming in Montana. Dust Bowl hit here 10 years before it hit down in the southwest, and that never happened. Their electrification, I think, is probably the most interesting part of the Milwaukee. At a time when everybody else was doing steam power, they actually were putting 3,000 volts DC through an overhead catenary, which was drawn into the engines by those pantographs, stick up, which were then converted through traction motors into propulsion to the rail. And the big advantage of an electric engine, well, it has a number of advantages, but number one is that in cold weather, it doesn't leak and the water doesn't freeze. And actually, electrification becomes more efficient in cold weather than in hot. And as they're going downhill, there was a switch in the locomotive you could switch, and they actually turn into generators. So the Milwaukee had it all figured out that if you set 2 trains downhill when 1 train's working uphill, the 2 could drink, and 0 expense for power. Unfortunately, Montana Power, who was providing all the electricity, and those of us who remember Montana Power will not be surprised by this story, charged a minimum rate that was so high that the Milwaukee could never, ever avoid paying electrification fees just because they regenerated anything. Later on, some of their most noteworthy engines are the Little Joes, who were built during World War II for export to Russia. That's why they're Little Joes, Little Joe Stalin. However, the Cold War broke out by the time they actually came off the assembly line, and they only made 20 of them, and they offered them to the Milwaukee, and the Milwaukee said, I don't think so. And a bunch of them were sent down to Brazil, and then the Milwaukee finally got around to buying 12, and they existed with 12 up until the end of electrification in 1974. This is a picture about 1973 in Missoula. I think it might even be the last electrics to come through Missoula. I'm not sure. I didn't take this picture. Now, the technology, basically, that the Milwaukee came up with is the same technology that's running trains on the railroads today. We all call them diesels because they got a big diesel prime mover in there. But the purpose of that big diesel prime mover is actually to turn an alternator to create electricity, which drives electric traction motors. And that's the same thing the Milwaukee was doing in 1917, only they didn't have the big diesel generator. They had to draw it from an overhead wire like a streetcar does. And the physical plant and the maintaining of that physical plant, the cost of that became absolutely prohibitive. In about 1972, they did an extensive study, actually they'd done a number of studies over the years, and decided that, excuse me, the cost of fuel oil for diesels, which was then about 24 cents a gallon, was cheaper than maintaining and replacing the overhead trolley line. And so they got rid of all their electrics, tore all the copper out, recycled the copper, just in time for the 1974 Arab oil embargo, when diesel oil went like diesel oil is going now, through the roof. 1980, when the railroad shut down, it was a long, drawn-out, agonizing process, lawsuits, Supreme Court, all that stuff. But finally, in March of 1980, the last train came through, and that old depot that is such a magnificent structure, looks pretty sad in this picture with all the windows boarded up. It had been bought by a group of Missoula investors who wanted to turn it into a casino and a supper club, and they did. And then they went bankrupt. And then Boone and Crockett's got a hold of it now, and they have refurbished that building. Unfortunately, like the NP depot, it's not a public space. If you go through there, you're going to be challenged. You're going to go in there. They're not unfriendly, but they're going to want to know what you're going to do. If you tell them you're a rail fan, you want to look at their building, you'll kind of see them melt a little bit. And in most cases, they'll show you around. I'm fortunate enough to be a presenter for the Leadership Missoula program. They seem to have me do things on railroads. Go figure, I wrote those books. And you take 25 or 30 young professional people who are being introduced into the mechanics of Missoula and how it functions and operates in the hopes that they will become leaders as you go down the line. And I think it's a very fine program. I support it 100%. And you let them sit in that boardroom in that reconstituted building and you explain to them about what it was like in 1912, 1913 when it served as the Missoula Division headquarters building. And you kind of see a little glimmer in their eyes of, you know, maybe railroads are an interesting facet of Missoula. So we'll kind of leave it there with why railroads are still important to Missoula. That sounds like a good place to end. And I just stole this yesterday from Montana Rail Link's homepage, which says down there at the bottom that they have 1,200 employees, that they pay $12.3 million in property taxes to the state of Montana and the cities and towns which they pass through, that they provide $67.2 million in goods and services in this state. And that's a 600-mile railroad that's doing that. The average railroad salary is somewhere around $75,000 a year. How many salaries out there in Missoula reach that level? So they're good employers, they pay their taxes, they do an essential service, and they're a pretty good neighbor. The Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation does a lot of nice things for this town. But that's not just Rail Link that's doing that. BNSF is the largest private landowner in Montana. Their budget is more than the state of Montana's. If you try to do something with BNSF, other than to stand back and take a picture of them, you're going to find out that they report directly to the ICC, and to tamper with them in any way is an infraction on interstate commerce, and you're going to have a visit from a federal marshal at some point and say, quit that. But let's look at railroads and what they do. They still account for 30 to 40% of the nation's traffic. Trucking has surpassed them. Trains Magazine, which is a journal of the people interested in railroads, says that the more trains try to act like UPS and go up to everybody's mailbox, the more money they lose. That their chink in the economic engine is bulk commodities in huge quantities transported at a slower pace but far less cost than trucking. And I would argue there's one more huge advantage. Who pays for the interstate highway system? And how much taxes do the interstate highway system pay to the state of Montana? Zero. It's government owned. Who pays for the building of airports? Most of them are a subset of state government, federal government, and with their own funding system. It's public money. Missoula International is no exception. How much taxes do they pay? So when you're out there on I-90, cruising down the highway, thinking how old-fashioned that train is that's lumbering along over there at 59 miles an hour beside you, keep this one thought in mind. They're on private land. They're paying taxes. And they're hauling huge commodities at a far less rate than that 18-wheeler. If you look at one of those big grain cars, you all know what those big jumbo hoppers look like. That's the equivalent of about 4.5 grain trucks on the highway. So if you take a 120-car grain train, and that's small these days, do the math. How many trucks does that take off the highway doing the same thing on highways that you pay for? Oh yes, so and I don't mean to insult any trucking. Don't throw wrenches at me. Because you pay taxes. Yes, you do. Trucks pay, I see those trailers going down the road, so this truck pays $6,000 taxes. I'm sorry, I'm biased. They tear up $18,000 worth of highway. So be it. Airport, you go out and pay your $700 to fly to wherever at the airport. That's money out of your pocket. Your taxes to pay for the airport are out of your pocket, and you get nothing back from them except a body search. They give you that free of charge. So I think railroads still have a function to play, an economic function. Remember my list at the beginning? We were going to do history, and then we're going to go do culture and economics. We're down to the economics part. They're still a very important player because of the efficiency of the steel wheel on the steel rail, and will continue to be so. I'm fortunate enough to be able to own a lot of railroad stock, and up until the last couple of weeks, it's done very well, and I think it will come back because railroads are a growth industry these days. BNSF wants Rail Link back. Why do you think they want it back? Got to be a nickel in it there somewhere, doesn't there? So I'm thinking that when that is done, we're going to see big changes out of BNSF locally. Maybe not, but I think so. And I don't know what those changes are. I'm not a fortune teller. Culturally, railroaders are a big part of our community. And railroading and the depots and all that they foster. Think about going down to Farmers Market in the shade of that beautiful building down there, how wonderful that is. Or if you're walking down through the old Milwaukee Yard on the south side of the river, which is now the trail down through there, culturally, that is a great experience, except for the dog poop. And, bless their souls, they have nice interpretive signs over there to explain what was going on when the railroad was there. So it's a big part of our culture here in Missoula as well. Now, there's one other little wrinkle I haven't talked about yet. I thought maybe Dave Strohmeyer would be here tonight. I specifically invited him. You've all seen Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority in the media, and I will say this, when that train arrives down here at the Missoula Depot, I'm going to be in line with a ticket, probably number 1, to get on that thing and ride it. But they have some hurdles to cross, and I think Mr. Strohmeyer would agree with me on that. Number 1, can you put a train on a system that is limited to 59 miles an hour and have anybody want to ride it? You think about your train going along between 2 coal trains and how that's working for you. We did that with the train I worked on, and we spent a lot of hours and a lot of sidings waiting for a coal train coming the other direction. That's not going to happen and make this a success. They're going to have to figure out a way that they can expedite that process. So what does that mean? That means probably either many upgrades to the existing trackage, like double tracking it, or a dedicated rail just for the passenger train. Either way, you're talking billions of dollars to bring it up to standards. That's a major hurdle, I think. The last time they did this, about 5-6 years ago, the Amtrak request for direct state contribution to the project was $140 million to get it started, and then about $7 or $8 million a year to keep it running. 10 years ago, what would it cost now? Is there political will in Montana to do that? I don't know. What Mr. Strohmeyer, and I wish he'd been here because you get all jazzed up, there's a lot of money in the infrastructure bill to support Amtrak, to bring it back up to where it should be. A lot of that's dedicated, thrown at the Empire Builder to put it back in competition. But I think there's money there to also put trains back on track that they no longer run on. There's a little wrinkle in the Amtrak law that if Amtrak ever ran on it, they always have rights to come back. Well, Amtrak did run on this line down here, so they would have rights to come back and use it if they chose to do so. Where would you buy a ticket? Can't do it at the Missoula Depot. It's not a public space. Online? Fair enough. Fair enough. Where would you get on it? Online. No, get on the train. You can't do that with digitals. I'm sorry, you got to actually get on. Now again, I got to say, I'm not counting them out. I think this is exciting. They certainly have a lot of support. It's being done politically on a county-by-county basis. They're bringing a lot of pressure to bear on interesting places in state and county governments. So we'll just wait and see. But maybe if I give this presentation 5 years from now, I'll have a whole new chapter of my story to talk about. So anyway, the end. Oh, by the way, I need somebody to take this on as a project. 1356 went into that park in 1955. When it went into that park, it had been newly rebuilt at the Tacoma Shops. It was under steam when it went in there. I have a picture taken from the second floor window of the depot looking at 1356 in the park with the whistle blowing, and I know that because there's a steam coming out of the whistle. Have you looked at it today? It's a mess. And I've made a couple runs at trying to get some interest in doing at least a cosmetic rehabilitation of that engine. And when I was doing it, the city couldn't even tell me who owns it. You would think it would belong to the Parks Department, right? No, they want no part of it. Or how about the street department, since it sits in the middle of the street? No way. Near as I can tell, it's sort of one of those things that is because it is, and it's always been here. But the longer they can ignore it, the better off they all are. It needs some desperate work. That is Missoula's engine. That was built in 1898. It lived in Missoula for most of its adult life. It worked down the Bitterroot. It worked over to Wallace. It worked east to Butte. It worked all the branch lines. And it served right up until about 1948 when it went in the river down here on the Bitterroot, when the bridge washed out, and it had to be towed back to Tacoma and rebuilt. And when steam was going out in the middle 50s, there it sat. And so NP gave it to Missoula. It's our problem now. So if anybody's interested in doing that, I would certainly be willing to help. It needs to be done big time or we're going to lose it. I used to be the farmer's market master. I had to climb up on that thing every day. And like this is in the 1990s. I can tell you the whole top of it is rusted out. The cab is rotten. The top of the boiler is tough shape. They never capped the stack, so all that water went down the stack and into the steam chests. When they redid Circle Square in, must have been about 1990 when they rebuilt Circle Square down there, they had to tow it out of the way so they could rebuild the park. That was something. I wish I had taken more pictures of that. They had an old boy who had worked in the roundhouse on steam engines. He came down and lubricated all the fittings and did everything he needed to do. And they got this great big 900 series Caterpillar front end loader with the rubber tires, and they hooked onto the front of it. They couldn't hang on to the wood because that's too rotten, but they got chains on the frame. And that cat went to run 8, tires flattened, the black smoke, and that thing didn't move an inch. So they went through and they re-lubricated it again. He made another run at it. And after about 60 seconds or so of that cat pulling on it, you finally heard this loud, and things started to kind of go. And they laid track panels down onto the end of the street down there. By the time I got down there, it was doing pretty good. And then it sat down there for 6 months, and somebody stole all the plaques off of it. And then they pushed it back, and it's been there ever since. So I've actually seen it move. Are there any questions? Hopefully you found this.
East of here and west of here, there's 2 brick buildings, and I'm going to call them. I want to know what kind of shape they're in, and if they're being protected, and should I call them substations or electric something? They're part of the Milwaukee. What are they, and what's the status of it?
Every 30 miles in the electric zone of the Milwaukee Road, there was one of those buildings. And they consisted of 2 parts. There was a transformer room which took 110,000 volts AC off the feeder line, converted it into 3,000 volts DC, and put it out on the catenary through a series of motor generators in the front part of the room. By the end of it, some of them were remote controlled, but initially there was people there doing that. When electrification stopped in 1974, used brick was in high demand for all kinds of remodeling projects. And so most of them got torn down almost immediately for the used brick market. These three, Gold Creek, Ravenna, and Primrose, all had Montana Power switching stations up on the roof, junction yards. And so they couldn't tear those down. And by the time Montana Power moved all that off the roof onto a separate switch yard, the used brick phase was gone, and so there they sit to this day. The one in Gold Creek is privately owned. Last I heard, a mining company owned it, and they were storing stuff inside of it. They're just brick shells. All the equipment's gone. Primrose is actually owned by the BLM. They've done, I'm sorry, Ravenna is owned by BLM. They've done a study on what recreational possibilities there are for that structure. Well, you got a big problem. The river's in between it and the highway, and the rest of it is private land. So last I heard from a lady by the name of Terry Wolfgram, who's the agent in charge, they're sort of just letting it sit until circumstances change, and maybe they'll come up with a plan for it. Primrose is in private ownership. A young man owns it. They live in the old housing out there. It's been extensively remodeled. I talked to him a couple years ago, and he had plans of making it an event center. But a lot of people had a lot of plans for that building that so far really haven't resulted in much. That's what I know about those buildings. Are they being preserved? Not that I've noticed. Ravenna gets graffitied every once in a while, and somebody goes over and cleans the graffiti off. Primrose gets a big fence. That's all I've seen happen there. And Gold Creek looks pretty good because it belongs to a mining company. Anybody?
Second question for you.
Sure.
I bought this book 22 years ago by Stephen Ambrose.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing like it in the world. Maybe 2000 it was published. And I read a chapter and I put it down. I haven't picked it up since. Is it pretty decent?
Well, I think so. You know, Stephen Ambrose is sort of the definitive historian for all things Lewis and Clark and railroad and anything else. He tells a good story. He does it well. If you enjoy reading about that, you'll enjoy the book. The Union Pacific is one of those original land grant railroads, which is something we didn't even get into tonight. Another reason why the NP was important to Missoula was the land grants it brought with it. They're the ones that got the right-of-way free and a mile square on either side in alternating sections. Or if where the construction was difficult, like in western Montana, they got up to 40 miles on either side of the railroad of alternating sections of land. At the time they got it, the land wasn't worth anything. Nobody out here except natives, and they didn't ship much on the railroad. But the railroads underwent a huge marketing campaign to sell that land, just about gave it away to get people out here that would ship things on the railroad, and we live in the results of that. If you have an abstract for deed on your property and you've lived here in the valley, go look at the first owner of your land and see who it might be. In many cases, it's the Northern Pacific Railroad. It was originally the land grant section. If you look at a modern Forest Service map of western Montana, you see that checkerboard pattern? That's the land grants. That's the alternating private and federal land. When BN was formed, they made a holding company, and they stripped off all the land assets into a company called Plum Creek Timber. Sound familiar? Plum Creek Timber logged it for years. They've sold to Weyerhaeuser, so I guess Weyerhaeuser owns all that land. Weyerhaeuser and Plum Creek before it generally have morphed into real estate companies who are selling it off to developers. Very little logging happening on that. So that's a whole other story. Made the NP very unpopular in Montana because local entrepreneurs saw the railroad stealing all opportunity with those lands. And they weren't surveyed, so nobody knew which one was, which one wasn't. It was just a big mess, and it made the NP very unpopular. More than you wanted to know, right? Alan?
If you look at the substations, you know, they're still out there, like River, that they were built by alternating contractors. there was no locking built through. And they were both working at the same time, and they moved down. But one contractor used mortar between the bricks. So you go out to Urbana, and it's all falling apart. That's because the mortar is a very long-term pile. Now, Primrose out here, that guy used cement as the mortar between the bricks. And that's why those walls are straight into the bricks are all working on. And if you follow all the way down the substation, that's where it was, which is the one east of here, a company in Portland bought it because that's what bricks were the big construction thing. Well, those were, the mortar was the concrete, that's the way that substation fell in because we couldn't separate enough to make some money.
Interesting.
There you go. The NP also has a brick story. You want to hear the brick story? The bricks in the Missoula NP depot were destined originally for building an office building in Tacoma, Washington. Railroad went bankrupt in '93. The building didn't get built. Along comes this project in 1901. They come here. And the Wallace Depot was built at the same time. If you look at the Wallace Depot, you look at the Missoula Depot, it's the same flat bricks. There, see? Almost as good as your story, Alan. Any?
We got lots at Washburn. There's that little branch that goes out north of there.
Switzer bricks.
Yeah, that was to, it was a clay pit to make brick. So they go over north, haul the bricks down, and they use them where they need.
I'm not much of an architectural student, but I know enough that in the early 1900s, there was an effort to fireproof buildings. There had been so many towns that burned down, and brick was the construction material. They called it making the building permanent when they built it out of brick. And so, you know, more or less degrees, that's what they did. There was a brickyard here in Missoula. Brick was a very easy to produce thing locally. It didn't cost you much in transport. Sir?
It used so well, didn't it?
You know if that was the locomotive they used in Timberjack?
No, it's not. That's the one out at the Historical Museum in Fort Missoula, that Willamette geared locomotive, which worked for ACM. It was originally bought by Western Timber in '23. It was the last Willamette built in Portland. And it was sitting out behind the mill when they wanted to film Timberjack. So they went in and refurbished it enough to get it to run. And the Timberjack is a horrible movie. I'm sorry, it's just flat corny. But there's wonderful shots of that engine running out there. And the guy who's restoring the Willamette out there hopes to have it running again at some point if he lasts that long. I had always heard that when they did it for the movie, they'd gone in with galvanized piping just to make it work. And then, of course, they didn't cap the stack, and it's all rusted. That was a big block of rust. Turns out that's not true. Turns out the innards aren't all that bad in it, according to this gentleman. Larry Ingold is his name.
Last winter, we took a class in here, dealt with railroads, was bringing kids from back east.
The orphan trains, yeah.
Oh, the orphan train, okay. The gentleman that did it, the presentation said that one railroad train, freight train, brings more freight in Missoula than 800 semis.
Well,
What's the question?
It's really hard to hear.
okay, I'm sorry, and I should repeat the question. Point taken. He's asking about the presentation we had a few weeks ago about the orphan train and a statement that was made by that presenter that it's the equivalent of 400 freight cars when a train comes to Missoula. And I think that's kind of the point I was trying to make with my unit train thing in the trucks, is about that same number. So you take a 120-car train at 4.5 trucks per car, do the math. It's a lot of trucks off the railroad. Or a lot of trucks back on if the railroads go away. Any other questions?
One more on the bridge under Orange Street. So that overpass was built in 1884?
No. It was built in 1933. is a WPA project. It was originally Harris Street that went across the railroad there to the north side. And if you look at old pictures that have that building in it, you'll see the street, which became Woody Street on the north side, going across. The only evidence I see of there ever being Higgins going across is in that 1884 photo map. Otherwise, I've never seen another picture with a road across from Higgins to the north side, because the railroad shops were always over there. Any other questions? Thank you, folks. Your patience is great, and thank you for coming.